There's a moment, and I think every soldier who's ever been in real combat knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment where your training just stops. Where all that drilling, all those hours on the range, all the briefings about protocol and chain of command and rules of engagement, it all just kind of falls away, and you're left with something much older. Something that doesn't have a name in any military manual I've ever read. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe just the plain, stupid human need to not let something die in front of you when you have the power to stop it. That's where this story starts. Not in some grand headquarters, not in front of cameras or medals or any of that. It starts in a corridor on the 63rd floor of the Velthari Embassy, at approximately 2:14 hours, on a Tuesday night that I will never forget for as long as I live. Which, depending on who you ask, might now be a very long time indeed. My name is Staff Sergeant Darian Cole. I'm 31 years old. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee. I joined the United Terran Defense Force at 19 because my dad did, and his dad did, and honestly because I had $17 in my bank account and a landlord who was tired of my face. I spent 6 years in the 14th Mobile Infantry before I got assigned to the Diplomatic Protection Corps, DPC, which sounds fancy, and I'll be honest, when I first got the posting I thought it was going to be fancy. Dress uniforms, white gloves, standing very still while important people shook hands. And it was that sometimes. But the DPC has another side that they don't put in the brochures. A side that involves guarding embassies in the middle of alien cities, carrying a pulse rifle in one hand and a universal translator in the other, and trying very hard not to say anything offensive to beings whose cultural history stretches back 40,000 years before humans figured out the wheel. We're the new kids in the galaxy. Everyone knows it. Some species find it charming. Some find it irritating. Some, and I've met a few of these, find it genuinely, philosophically offensive that we made it to the stars at all. The Velthari fall into a complicated category that doesn't map cleanly onto any of those options. Let me explain the Velthari, because if I'm going to tell this story right, you need to understand who they are and what they mean in the context of the Galactic Accord, and more importantly, what it means that one of them was dying on the floor in front of me. The Velthari are old. I don't mean old like the Keth, who have been spacefaring for 600 years, or old like the Myrathian Collective, who seeded their first colony worlds before Rome fell. I mean old in a way that makes human civilization feel like something that happened last Thursday. The Velthari have records, actual, verified, cross-referenced records, going back to a time when the Milky Way's spiral arms were still forming. They've watched species rise and collapse. They've seen empires that dwarfed anything humanity has ever imagined turn to dust and scatter across the void. And they're still here. Part of that longevity is their biology, which is where things get complicated, culturally speaking. The Velthari are what the xenobiologists on our side call hemivores, and what the Velthari themselves call, in their own language, something that translates roughly as those who carry life within life. Their cells don't produce energy through conventional metabolic pathways. They require a periodic infusion of what they call veil, a term that doesn't have a direct translation, but is roughly analogous to what we would call life force, a concentrated biological compound found in the blood of other sentient beings. So yes, in the most functional biological sense, the Velthari are vampires. That word gets thrown around a lot by people who don't know any better, and every time I hear it used casually, I want to grab whoever said it and explain very carefully that the Velthari are not the vampires from old Earth horror movies. They're not monsters. They're not predators in any aggressive sense. The consumption of veil is a managed, regulated, voluntary process within the Galactic Accord framework. There are donors, certified, compensated, entirely willing, on every world that maintains a Velthari diplomatic presence. There are protocols, There are medical staff. There are rules. And on the night I'm describing, all of those rules meant absolutely nothing, because Seraphine Veilthar Oren, third daughter of the High Seat, heir secondary of the ancient lines, and the being I had been assigned to protect for the past 4 months, was bleeding out on the floor of a maintenance corridor, and her attendant was dead, and the nearest certified donor suite was 6 floors below us, and we had maybe 15 minutes. Let me back up. Let me tell you how we got there. The Velthari Embassy on Korath Station is one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen in my life, and I grew up in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, so I know what beautiful looks like. It occupies the entire upper tier of the station's diplomatic ring, 20 floors of architecture that doesn't so much as touch the station's original structure. It floats within a frame of its own construction, suspended by what the Velthari engineers call passive resonance fields, but which are, essentially, gravity manipulation on an architectural scale. The walls are grown, not built, living crystal lattices that the Velthari cultivate over centuries. They shift color with the ambient light, deep indigo in the station's artificial night cycle, luminous silver in the day cycle, and during their own ceremonial times, colors that I genuinely cannot describe because human eyes aren't quite calibrated for them. My first week there, I walked into Seraphine's receiving chamber and stopped dead in the doorway because the walls were doing something I'd never seen before, a slow, rolling cascade of what I can only call warm dark, like if darkness could be comfortable and safe instead of threatening. One of the other DPC guards, a woman named Erica Voss who'd been on post for 2 years already, grabbed my arm and pulled me through without breaking stride. "Don't stare," she said quietly. "It's a private color. She uses it when she's tired." I learned a lot from Erica in those first months. The Velthari communicate more through their environment than through words. The crystals in the walls reflect the emotional state of whoever commands them. If you pay attention, really pay attention, you can tell more about what a Velthari is feeling from the color of their walls than from anything they say out loud. Seraphine almost never said what she felt out loud. That was the other thing I learned about her, slowly, over the weeks I spent standing in doorways and corridors and reception halls, while she conducted the business of being heir secondary of one of the most powerful dynasties in the known galaxy. She was careful, measured. Every word she spoke had been considered before it left her mouth. She had the kind of stillness that you see in people who have learned, maybe been forced to learn, that showing what you actually feel is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities get used against you. She was also, underneath all of that, quietly funny. Not in a showy way. In a way where she'd say something so perfectly observed and so understated that it would take you a full 3 seconds to realize it was a joke, and by then she'd already moved on, and you'd be standing there trying not to smile because smiling in a formal diplomatic setting is a protocol violation. I may have committed several protocol violations in the privacy of my own face during those 4 months. The night it happened, there was a function. There was always a function. The Velthari diplomatic calendar is structured around something their scholars call the rhythm of connection. Essentially, a philosophy that relationships between species must be actively maintained through shared ritual, shared space, shared time, which in practice means that the embassy hosted some kind of formal gathering approximately every 6 days. This one was what they called a second table, a mid-tier diplomatic event, not a full state occasion, but formal enough that everyone was in dress uniform, and the catering had been sourced from 3 different planetary systems. My assignment was secondary perimeter on the upper floor, meaning I was positioned at the intersection of the formal gathering space and the private residential wing, making sure that no guests wandered somewhere they weren't supposed to be. It's a boring post, I'll be honest about that. You stand, you check credentials, you direct confused dignitaries back toward the refreshment stations. It's not glamorous, But boring is usually good in security work. Boring means nothing is going wrong. The evening was boring right up until 21:43 hours, when I heard something through the wall. And here's the thing, the walls of the Velthari embassy are living crystal. They don't transmit sound the way normal walls do. They absorb it, usually. You almost never hear anything through them. Which is why, when I heard what I heard, it cut through everything else like a blade. It was a sound I'd heard twice in my life before that night. Once in the field, during a border engagement on the Keth frontier. Once in a training exercise that went wrong. It was the sound of a body hitting the floor. I moved without thinking. That's not me being a hero. That's just what happens when your nervous system has been trained to respond to certain sounds in certain ways. I wasn't thinking about protocol or clearance or whether I should radio my team leader first. My body was already moving through the maintenance access door before my brain fully caught up with what was happening. The maintenance corridors in the embassy are different from the public spaces. The crystal walls are there but dormant, dark, opaque, utilitarian in a way that nothing else in the building is. The lighting is a cold, functional blue that comes from strip panels along the ceiling. It smells like recycled air and something faintly metallic that I'd never been able to identify. I came through the door, swept right the way I'd been trained, swept left. And stopped. Seraphine was on the floor. There are images that get burned into your memory. Permanent. Installed. You don't choose which ones stick and you don't get to take them out. That image, Seraphine Velthar Oren in her formal reception gown, which was a deep violet-black material that moved like it was alive, crumpled against the crystal wall of a maintenance corridor. That image is never leaving me. Her attendant, a young male Velthari named Kethris, was on the floor 6 feet away from her. He wasn't moving. I could see from the angle of his neck that he wasn't going to move again, and I'd been in enough situations to know the difference between unconscious and gone. There was something on the wall above him. A long, scorched line, like something had discharged an energy weapon at close range and tried to make it look like an accident. It hadn't looked like an accident to me. It didn't now. Seraphine turned her head when she heard me. Her eyes, the Velthari have eyes that are almost entirely black, dark iris with just a thin ring of silver at the edge. Her eyes were different. The silver was gone. Just absolute black, which I'd learned by then was what happens when a Velthari's metabolic reserves drop below critical threshold. Their biology shuts down peripheral functions first. Pigmentation response is one of them. She said my name. That surprised me. We weren't on a first-name basis. I was Staff Sergeant Cole in every interaction we'd had, and she was Your Serenity, and there was about 47 feet of protocol between us at all times. But she said Cole, just that, just my last name, like she'd been waiting to use it, and now was the only time she was going to get, and that more than anything else told me how bad it was. Kethris, she started. I see him, I said. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then she opened them again and she said, with that careful precision she always used, you need to go. You need to get away from here and call your team and let them handle this. I'm not leaving you. Cole, she said my name again, differently this time. I am going to die in this corridor in approximately, she paused, and I realized she was doing some kind of internal calculation. 11 minutes, and I would prefer to do that without a witness and without a human soldier bearing the weight of having been present. 11 minutes, I said. Metabolic failure, my reserves are. She stopped. She looked at me. Please go. I didn't go. I stood there for about 4 seconds, which felt like 4 years, running through what I knew about Velthari biology, which was more than most DPC soldiers knew, because I'm the kind of person who reads the supplementary briefing materials that most people skip, and because I'd been on this post for 4 months and Seraphine was my assignment, and I believed in knowing everything there was to know about the people I was responsible for. What I knew, Velthari metabolic crisis is survivable if Veil is administered within the critical window. The longer you wait, the more the cells break down. After a certain point, 12 minutes is the standard medical literature estimate, 11 if the individual's reserves are already compromised. Cell degradation becomes irreversible. I also knew this. I was a DPC soldier. I had a standard issue biotech kit on my belt. The kit included, because DPC soldiers work in multi-species environments, a basic hemophoresis unit, a blood filter, designed primarily for emergency situations involving Velthari personnel, because the UTDF figured that if we were going to station soldiers in Velthari embassies, we should give them the tools to handle a crisis. I had the tool. I had the time barely. I did not have, technically, permission. Here's the part where people always want me to explain my thought process, and I genuinely struggle with that because there wasn't much of a process. I'd like to say there was some noble calculation happening, some weighing of options and evaluation of risk. That's not what occurred. What occurred was that I looked at Seraphine dying on the floor, and some part of me that existed well below the level of rational thought said, no, not this, not on my watch. How much do you need? I asked. She looked at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't know. What? I was already pulling the hemophoresis unit off my belt. To stabilize, not for full recovery, just to stabilize. How much Veil do you need to get through the next hour? Cole. I have the unit. I have the time. Tell me how much. There was a long silence. In that silence, the walls around us, the dormant crystal, did something I hadn't expected. A faint color moved through them, just a trace, like heat shimmer but purple, deep and uncertain. I didn't know what that color meant. I learned later. It meant she was afraid, not of dying, afraid of what she was about to say. 40 milliliters, she said. 40 would stabilize me. But Cole, you don't understand what you're offering. I'm offering 40 milliliters, I said, and I was already rolling up my sleeve. Among my people, the sharing of Veil is, she stopped again. It is not a simple transaction. It is not like a blood donation. There are consequences. Serenity. I sat down on the floor next to her because she was on the floor and I figured being at eye level was the respectful thing to do. With respect, tell me the consequences after. Right now we have about 9 minutes. I won't describe the technical details of the hemophoresis process in clinical language because this isn't a medical briefing. What I'll tell you is what it felt like, which was strange in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for at the time. The unit extracts and filters. My blood went in one side. The Veil compound was isolated. Apparently human blood carries it, which I had not known, not in a usable form but close enough that the unit's conversion matrix could synthesize what she needed, and the output went into the line that connected to her. The whole process takes about 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes she didn't speak. I didn't speak. The walls around us moved through colors I couldn't name. At some point I became aware that she was watching me, not looking at me, watching, the way you watch something that matters. When the unit chimed and the process was complete, I felt, and this is going to sound like I'm exaggerating, but I promise I'm not, I felt different. Not sick, not weak, just different, like the air pressure had changed, like something that had been entirely mine a few minutes ago was now partially somewhere else. The silver came back to her eyes. It came back slowly, starting at the outer edge and moving inward like frost forming in reverse. And when it was fully back, she looked at me with those silver-ringed eyes and she said, "What you've done is going to change things." "Are you stable?" I asked. "Yes." "Good." I started getting to my feet. "Then we need to call this in, because whoever did that to Kethris is still." Cole, her hand closed around my wrist. "Velthari don't touch humans casually. It's a significant cultural gesture, the kind of thing that gets covered in 3 separate briefings before you start a DPC posting. When a Velthari makes physical contact with a being of another species, it means something specific and important, and I'd been careful for 4 months to maintain appropriate distance. Her hand on my wrist felt like something I'd always known was going to happen. "You need to understand," she said, "what you've done. I stabilized you. You gave me your veil," she said it simply, clearly, like she was reading a fact from a document, freely, without coercion, within a crisis which under our law constitutes a binding witness moment. "Cole, what you did tonight," she paused. "My people will say you claimed me." I stared at her. "Or," she added, with the kind of precise care she always used for difficult information, "they will say I was claimed by you." The directionality is actually a matter of significant theological debate within our tradition, and I could explain it if now were the appropriate time. "It's not," I said, still staring. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." Her hand was still on my wrist. The walls were doing something extraordinary, a color I'd never seen before, something between gold and silver, something that flickered at the edges like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I found out later what that color meant too. It meant she had already decided something, even if I hadn't yet. Getting to the point where we called it in took another 6 minutes, which I spent with my back against the opposite wall, holding the radio, listening to Erica Voss's voice run through the standard security response pattern on the other end, telling me that QRF was en route, that the function had been suspended, that the ambassador was being informed. Seraphine sat where she was and watched me with those silver-ringed eyes, and I tried very hard not to think about what she'd said, and mostly failed. Kethris had been killed by an energy weapon discharged at contact range. Someone had gotten close to him, which meant someone who had access to the corridor, which meant someone who had either breached security or been inside it. The investigation was going to be complicated. It was going to involve people well above my pay grade. I knew that. I filed it away. What I couldn't file away was this. As the QRF came through the door at the far end of the corridor, 8 soldiers in full tactical kit, sweep pattern perfect, I heard Seraphine say something very quietly to herself in Velthari. My translator is good but not perfect with colloquialisms and murmured speech. What it gave me was something like, "I should have been afraid of this. I'm not." I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. A lot. The debrief lasted 14 hours. I'm not exaggerating. 14 hours in 3 different rooms with 3 different levels of authority. First, it was my direct chain of command. Then it was the DPC intelligence section. Then it was a joint Velthari Terran panel that I had to sit in front of in my dress uniform. Because at that point, what had started as a security incident investigation had acquired a diplomatic dimension that nobody on our side had dealt with before. Because Seraphine had told them. She had told them exactly what had happened, exactly what I'd done, and exactly what it meant under Velthari law and custom. I sat in front of the joint panel, 5 humans on one side, 5 Velthari on the other, and in the center of the table, a Velthari elder whose name I never learned to pronounce correctly and whose age, I was quietly informed, was somewhere in the range of 4,000 years. And I answered their questions as accurately and honestly as I could. Yes, I had administered the hemophoresis without prior authorization. Yes, I had been aware that it was outside standard protocol. No, I had not been coerced or influenced in any way. Yes, I understood the potential implications. That last answer was, strictly speaking, not accurate. I did not understand the implications. I was about to. The elder, I will call him the elder because that's the closest English translation of his actual title, spoke to me directly for about 20 minutes at the end of the panel session. He spoke in formal Velthari, and the translator did its best, but there's a quality to the formal register of that language that doesn't really survive translation. It's like trying to describe music in a language that doesn't have musical notation. What he said, stripped of the formal register, was roughly this. The sharing of veil between species is not unknown. It has happened before in Velthari history, but it has never happened not once in 40,000 years of recorded interactions, under the specific circumstances I had created. Free, willing, crisis witnessed, from a soldier sworn to protection. Those four elements together constitute something in Velthari law called a veil sathira, which has no direct translation but means something like life bond made in darkness. The veil sathira, he explained, creates a mutual obligation. Not just emotional, biological. The Velthari believe, and their biology may in fact support this, the xenobiologists on our team were still arguing about it, that the exchange of veil in a crisis bond creates a resonance between the two individuals involved, that each one becomes partially a reference point for the other's cellular stability. That separation, extended, prolonged separation, causes a kind of degradation in both parties. It had never been tested between a human and a Velthari before. They didn't know how strong the resonance would be. They didn't know whether the degradation would manifest the same way in a human as in a Velthari. They had theories. They had historical analogues involving other species. They didn't have certainty. What they had was this. Seraphine Veilthar Oren, heir secondary of the ancient lines, had stated formally before the panel that she would not authorize my reposting away from the embassy. She would not authorize it. I sat in my chair and looked at the elder and said, "Can she do that?" He said, in the closest thing to dry humor I ever heard from a Velthari elder, "She has already done it." My commanding officer, Major Priya Okonkwo, called me into her office after the panel session. She had the kind of face that doesn't show surprise, because she'd been in the field long enough that surprise was a luxury she'd given up on. But there were certain things around her eyes, when she looked at me across her desk, that told me she was working very hard to maintain that expression. "Cole," she said. "Ma'am, walk me through your thinking." She was dying, ma'am. She waited. I had the equipment, I had the time, I made a judgment call. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The Velthari diplomatic team has filed a formal protocol adjustment request with the DPC Central Command. They've requested that your posting be extended indefinitely and reclassified to close protection." She paused. "Which means you would be reassigned from secondary perimeter to direct, personal security for the princess." I absorbed that. "She specifically requested you?" I asked. Okonkwo's expression did something complicated. "The word they used," she said carefully, "was required. She specifically required you." I asked to speak with Seraphine the following morning. I went through proper channels, filed the request with her secretariat, and expected it to take a day or two because that's how the embassy worked. Everything went through layers of protocol. Everything had a process. I was prepared to wait. She received me in 20 minutes. Not in her formal reception chamber. In what I can only describe as a private sitting room, a space I'd never been in before, smaller, warmer. The walls doing that quiet deep indigo color that I now knew meant she was tired but not distressed. There was furniture in here that didn't come from any species catalog I recognized. Old, softened with time. It made the room feel lived in, which nothing else in the embassy quite did. She was sitting when I came in. Standing when a non-Velthari enters your private space is a gesture of elevated respect in their culture, and she did it anyway, which I noticed even as I was trying to compose the things I needed to say. "Staff Sergeant Cole," she said. "Your Serenity," I paused. I paused again. "I want to make sure you're all right first." "I am stable," she said, "because of you." "Good," I took a breath. "I also want to be honest with you about some concerns." She tilted her head slightly. She did that when she was listening carefully. I'd noticed it over the months. I made a decision in the corridor, because it was the right decision to make in that moment. I don't regret it, but I didn't make it knowing what it would mean under your law, and I want you to understand that. I met her eyes. I don't want there to be any ambiguity between us about what I intended and what I understood at the time. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I know. You know. I know that you acted without full knowledge of the consequences. That is recorded in the testimony. It is part of why the elder's ruling was, she paused, choosing her word carefully, complex. She looked at me. Cole, may I ask you something directly? Yes. If you had known beforehand everything that sharing your veil would mean, the bond, the obligation, the complication to your assignment, would you have done it differently? I didn't answer immediately. I gave it real thought, the kind of thought that takes long enough that most people get uncomfortable with the silence. She didn't get uncomfortable. She waited like she had all the time in any universe. No, I said finally, I don't think I would have. The walls shifted, that gold-silver uncertain flicker again, brief, gone before I could be sure I'd really seen it. Then the bond is not a complication, she said. It is simply what is. In the weeks following that night, the investigation into Kethras's death moved forward. I won't detail everything about it here. Some of it is still classified, and some of it involves political structures within the Velthari noble hierarchy that I still don't fully understand. What I can tell you is that there was a faction, a minor one, that had believed they had something to gain from Seraphine not surviving to reach her formal ascension. They had underestimated the security of the embassy. They had also, significantly, underestimated what a human soldier who takes his duty seriously is willing to do. The investigation resolved, people faced consequences, the faction collapsed. And I remained at my post. My new post, close protection, which meant I was in the room instead of the corridor, which meant I was 3 feet away instead of 30, which meant I spent my days in very close proximity to someone who was, by every measure I had, the most interesting person I'd ever met. That's a complicated thing to say about a 4,000-year-old vampire princess from the oldest surviving civilization in the galaxy. But it was true. She read constantly. I don't mean that casually. She consumed information the way some people drink water, steadily and without drama, always with 3 or 4 different texts open simultaneously, moving between them with the ease of someone whose mind works at a speed mine could only partially track. She'd been alive long enough to have watched empires form and fail and reform. She had opinions about events in human history that humans had forgotten. She had a map on one wall of her study, actual drawn, hand-updated, breathtaking in its detail of the galaxy as it looked 300 years ago, and she updated it regularly with thin silver lines marking changes. She asked me questions. That was the other thing I hadn't expected. Most people in positions of authority interact with their protective detail the way you interact with very well-trained furniture. She asked me questions, real ones, about Earth, about the military, about what I thought, what I believed, what mattered to me. I tried to answer honestly. It seemed like the least I could offer. About 6 weeks after the corridor, she called me into her study at the end of a particularly long day. There'd been another function, which had run 3 hours over because of an ongoing trade dispute between 2 species I'd never heard of before my posting. And she closed the door, which was unusual, and she sat down at her desk, and she looked at me with that careful stillness of hers. I need to tell you something, she said, about the bond. I'd been waiting for this conversation. I'd been waiting for it since the elder's explanation, through all the debriefs and the protocol adjustments and the days of close protection work. I'd been waiting and trying not to think about what I was waiting for. All right, I said. The resonance is stronger than we expected, she said. Our medical staff have been monitoring both of us. The biological markers in your system, she paused. Cole, you are already changing. I thought about that moment in the corridor when the process was done, when I'd felt different in a way I didn't have words for. Changing how? I asked. She held my gaze. The veil I received from you has integrated differently than anticipated. Human biology responds to the bond by producing. She stopped, started again. You're going to live longer, significantly longer. We don't know how long. We've never had a human bond partner before. I sat down without being invited to, which is a significant protocol violation, and she didn't say anything about it. How much longer? I asked. We don't know, she said. More than a normal human lifespan. Possibly much more. I sat with that for a long time. You should be angry, she said quietly. You had no way to consent to that outcome. Were you going to die if I hadn't? I asked. Yes. Then I stopped, started again. Then I'd do it again, I said. I already told you that. The walls did the gold-silver thing again, but this time it didn't disappear quickly. It stayed. It settled into the crystal like it had always been there. I found out later what that color was called in Vilthari. The translation isn't perfect. The closest I can get in English is certainty after a long time of not being certain. At the end of part 1, this is where I am. I am Staff Sergeant Darian Cole, 31 years old, assigned to close protection duty for the air secondary of the Vilthari Ancient Lines, in an embassy that floats in the middle of Korath Station, where I have been for 4 months and will apparently be for considerably longer. I gave 40 milliliters of blood to keep someone from dying. In return, I received something that might be a curse, might be a gift, and might be both of those things at the same time, and I'm still working out which. And the princess who refuses to let me leave. She's sitting 12 feet away from me right now, reading something 3 centuries old, and every now and then she says something so perfectly calibrated to exactly the thing I was thinking that I've stopped being surprised by it, and started, quietly, being grateful. 7 months after the corridor, Korath Station got a new diplomatic arrival, and that arrival changed everything in ways I was not remotely prepared for. Let me set the scene for you because scene matters. Context matters. If you understand the station, you understand why what happened next was as significant as it was. Korath Station exists at the intersection of 3 contested shipping lanes, in a system that no single galactic power owns outright, but which everyone wants to influence. It's been a diplomatic hub for about 400 years, which in galactic terms is recent, but in human terms feels ancient. And in that time, it's accumulated the kind of layered, complicated social ecosystem that happens when you put 17 different species in close proximity for long enough that they start to work out how to live with each other. It's not peaceful exactly. It's more like a controlled tension, an ongoing negotiation, a city-sized argument that has so far stayed on the right side of violence. There are neighborhoods, districts, technically, but everyone calls them neighborhoods that belong to different species, or rather belong to the communities of those species who have settled on the station. There are market levels and transit corridors, and the kind of informal gathering spaces that develop wherever beings congregate long enough. The DPC has a presence at every major embassy on the station. We're not the only security service operating here. The station has its own security corps, and most embassies have their own private protection details. But we're the Terran face at the diplomatic level, and that matters more than it used to, because humanity has been moving up in the hierarchy of galactic influence, slowly and sometimes painfully, and everyone knows it. The Vilthari, who have been watching species rise for longer than most, have a particular interest in where humanity ends up. They've told us that directly. It's one of the more clarifying things that happens when you start having actual conversations with beings who have watched entire civilizations run their full arc. It focuses your thinking about what you want your civilization to become. The new arrival, was a delegation from the Vrethkai Assembly. If you don't know who the Vrethkai are, you're in the majority. They're not a species that Earth has had much contact with, because they operate primarily in the outer spiral regions, and because they have a communication style that most human diplomats have found, to put it diplomatically, challenging. The Vrethkai communicate through a combination of chemical signals, subsonic vibration, and a visual language that involves the controlled movement of bioluminescent patterns across their bodies. They do have a spoken language, and most senior Vrethkai diplomats have translators, but the spoken language is secondary to them, and they tend to regard species who rely primarily on speech as the politest translation I've heard is limited. They're also, and this is the part that matters to my story, one of the few species in the Galactic Accord that has a formal, unresolved territorial dispute with the Velthari. Not a military dispute. Nobody in the Accord is stupid enough to start a military dispute with the Velthari, but a diplomatic one, involving 3 planetary systems in the mid-spiral region where both Velthari and Vrethkai claims overlap. The dispute had been ongoing for about 60 years. There had been talks. The talks had produced frameworks. The frameworks had produced committees. The committees had met many times. Very little had been resolved. And now a Vrethkai delegation had arrived on Korath Station, specifically requesting a meeting with Seraphine. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things that affected my post. Seraphine told me directly, before the formal notification came through channels. She had a habit of that. She'd give me the real information first, and then let the official communications catch up. She did it because she'd learned in the months since the corridor that I did my job better when I had full context. And she was right about that. Most of my DPC training had been about process and protocol, and those are genuinely important. But the thing that kept the person you were protecting safe was understanding the full shape of the situation they were in. Seraphine understood that. She gave me everything she thought I needed, which was, in itself, a kind of trust that I didn't take lightly. The Vrethkai delegation will arrive in 3 days, she said, on a morning when the station was in the early part of its light cycle, and the embassy walls were doing that soft silver that I'd come to associate with her focused, working mood. I want you to read the briefing materials on the territorial dispute, all of them. The current summaries aren't sufficient. The current summaries are 400 pages, I said. Yes, she didn't look up from what she was reading. There's also a supplementary historical analysis that's about twice that. I looked at her. She looked up. There was something in her expression that might have been a smile if a smile was performed by someone who decided that smiling was a variable rather than a fixed expression. I'll mark the sections most relevant to the current negotiations, she said. That will bring it down to a manageable length. Define manageable. Fewer than 300 pages, she said, and returned to her reading. I read the materials, all of them, including the supplementary analysis. I did it over 2 nights, working through the station's dark cycle when everything was quiet, drinking terrible coffee from the diplomatic wing's vending unit, which dispensed something that claimed to be coffee and was approximately in the right neighborhood. The Vrethkai dispute was complicated, in ways I hadn't appreciated from the surface-level briefings. It wasn't really about territory in the simple sense of, we want this space and so do you. It was about what the territory represented, and what it represented was different for each side. For the Velthari, the 3 systems were part of a cultural continuity, a thread of connected history going back to before the Vrethkai had achieved spaceflight. For the Vrethkai, they were part of an expansion pattern that had carried biological and ideological significance through 3 generations. Both claims were, in their own framework, entirely legitimate. Both parties had been talking around that, without acknowledging it directly for 60 years. I wrote that down in the margin of my notes. I make notes in the margins always, Learned it from a professor during one semester of college before I dropped out and joined the service, and I sat with it for a while. Then I went back to sleep, because I had an early post and opinions above my pay grade don't do anyone any good if you're running on 4 hours. The Vrethkai delegation arrived 3 days later. They came through the main diplomatic receiving bay in a group of 7, a much larger delegation than normal for a preliminary meeting, which Seraphine had noted was itself a signal, though of what exactly she was still calibrating. They were tall beings. The tallest ones came to about 8 feet, and they moved in a way that made the space around them feel different, like they were displacing more than just air. The bioluminescent patterns on their bodies were running in what my briefing materials told me was their diplomatic register, formal, controlled, precisely calibrated. I was positioned at Seraphine's left shoulder. Close protection, formal arrangement, the way we'd worked it out over months. She moved, I moved. I kept a 3-foot standard buffer between her and any approaching party, adjusted for cultural protocols that varied by species, and I did it without making it obvious because obvious security makes diplomatic interactions uncomfortable. The Vrethkai lead diplomat, the one with the most elaborate bioluminescent patterns, which indicated seniority, arrived at the formal greeting point and performed the opening gesture of the Vrethkai diplomatic greeting sequence. And then stopped. They stopped, and all 7 of them went very still, and the bioluminescent patterns shifted in a way that my translator flagged as significant unexpected information received. They were looking at me. Not at Seraphine, at me. What I didn't know, what nobody had thought to put in the briefing materials, probably because nobody had anticipated it would be relevant, was that the Vrethkai have a biological sensitivity to veil. Not the ability to produce or consume it, but the ability to detect it. Their chemosensory apparatus is extraordinarily sophisticated, and veil has a specific signature that they can identify. They could smell it in me, or whatever the Vrethkai equivalent of smelling is. They could detect the veil integrated into my biology from the bond, and they knew what that meant. The lead diplomat turned to Seraphine and said something through their translator that came out as, "You have made a claim." Seraphine was very still. The walls of the receiving chamber, which the embassy could control even in formally shared spaces, were doing a neutral gray that gave nothing away. "A bond was formed," she said carefully. "The circumstances were specific. Between a Velthari heir and a human soldier," the Vrethkai diplomat said. Their bioluminescent patterns were doing something rapid and complex that my translator was struggling to keep up with. "This is significant." "For many reasons," Seraphine agreed. The Vrethkai diplomat turned and looked at me directly. Their eyes were unlike anything I'd seen before, multiple-faceted, like an insect's but larger, and currently lit from within by the same bioluminescence as the rest of them. Looking into them was like looking into something that had too much information behind it. "Human," the diplomat said, "you are the bonded." "I'm Staff Sergeant Darian Cole," I said. "I'm the close protection officer for Her Serenity." The diplomat made a sound that my translator rendered as something like amusement, which isn't very precise, but was the best it could do. "That is not what I asked." I looked at Seraphine. She gave me the smallest nod I've ever seen, but it was there. "Yes," I said, "I'm the bonded." The bioluminescent patterns of all 7 Vrethkai shifted simultaneously. Something coordinated. Something, I'd learn later, that their culture associated with a moment of serious recalibration. "Then," the lead diplomat said slowly, "we have more to discuss than we expected." The negotiations over the following 3 weeks were the most intense experience of my professional life, and I've been in combat. Here's why. The Vrethkai arrival and their discovery of the bond between Seraphine and me had introduced a variable that nobody on either side had planned for. The Vrethkai view the Veil Sathira, the life bond, as one of the most significant acts in Velthari culture, and they'd been conducting their diplomatic strategy for 60 years on the assumption that the Velthari, specifically Seraphine's line, would maintain a certain kind of separation from non-Velthari interests. A bond with a human soldier shattered that assumption. It wasn't a problem for them. That's the thing I had to understand. The Vrethkai are not a species that deals in simple antagonism. They're a species that deals in information and recalibration. The bond was new information. They were calibrating. What they were calibrating toward was a question. Specifically, if the heir secondary of the Velthari ancient lines had formed a Veil Sathira with a human, if she had, in their words, allowed a human into the oldest part of what she is, then what did that mean for the galactic calculus that had kept the territorial dispute unresolved for 6 decades? It meant, potentially, that the Velthari position in the dispute could shift. That Seraphine's perspective on the 3 contested systems might be informed by a relationship with a species that had no historical stake in the conflict, no legacy claim, no generational memory of what those systems had meant before either the Velthari or the Vrethkai arrived. It meant, and I only understood this slowly, over many long meetings where I stood very still and listened very carefully, that I had become, without intending it, a kind of wild card in a negotiation that had been stuck in the same position for 60 years. And Seraphine had known this would happen, not the specific timing, not the specific delegation, but she had known that the bond would change the diplomatic landscape. She had told me things would change. I hadn't fully understood the scale of it. On the 8th day of negotiations, the lead Vrethkai diplomat requested a private meeting with me. Not with Seraphine, not with the Velthari diplomatic team, with me specifically in my capacity as the bonded. Seraphine could have refused this request. Under the applicable protocols, she had grounds to do so. She didn't refuse. She looked at me across the study where we'd been reviewing that day's session notes, and she said, "They want to understand you. They want to know what kind of person forms a bond like ours." "What kind of person does?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "In our history," she said slowly, "every Veil Sathira that was formed across species lines, and there have been a handful, very few, was formed by someone who acted before they thought, who let something more fundamental than logic drive them." She paused. "It's not an insult." "I know," I said. "The Vrethkai want to know if that person is someone who can be trusted with what they're going to say in this negotiation," she said. "They've decided that you are the indicator." "Why me? Why not you?" "Because they've been reading me for 60 years, she said. "They know everything about how I think and what I want. They don't know you, and they can detect the veil in you, which means they trust your biology more than your politics." I thought about that. "What do they want from the negotiation?" I asked. "Ultimately, not the position, what do they actually want?" She looked at me for a moment. "What the briefing materials told you." "The briefing materials said it's about territorial rights to 3 systems." "Yes, but the supplementary analysis said it's about what the territory means, not what it is," I said. "And what it means is different to each side." Something happened in her expression, something that was becoming more familiar to me, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it. The thing that happened when I said something she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said. "So what they actually want is for someone to acknowledge that their meaning is legitimate, even if the territory goes another way," I said. "That the history they've built in those systems has value even in loss." The walls did the gold-silver thing. "Will you take the meeting?" she asked. "Yes," I said. The Vrethkai diplomat and I met in a small conference room on the station's neutral diplomatic level, territory that belonged to neither embassy, which was itself significant. The diplomat brought no subordinates. I brought my translator and my training, and the notes I'd made in the margins of 400 pages of briefing materials. We sat across from each other for a long moment without speaking. The diplomat's bioluminescent patterns were running in something my translator called open register, which meant, as best I could understand, that they were making themselves legible, giving me their real state rather than a diplomatic performance. I decided to reciprocate that honesty as best I could. "You want to know why I did it," I said. "Why I bonded with her." The patterns shifted, something like, "Yes, but more than that." "I want to know what you understood," the diplomat said, "in that moment." "I understood she was dying," I said. "I understood I could stop it. That was the whole of what I understood." "And what you didn't understand?" "Everything else," I said. "The bond, the consequences, the diplomatic dimension we're sitting in right now, all of it came later." The bioluminescent patterns ran through something complex and slow. "Then, the Vilthari have been our diplomatic counterparts for 400 years. In that time, we have found them to be precise, careful, strategic. Every interaction has been calculated. They do not act before they understand the consequences." "I know," I said. "She permitted the bond," the diplomat said. "She could have refused. She could have endured the crisis rather than accept a bond from someone who didn't understand what they were offering." "I know," I said again. "She did not refuse." The patterns shifted again. "Which means she wanted it. Which means Seraphine Veilthar Oren, Heir Secondary, made a decision that was," the translator struggled for a moment, "unprecedented, spontaneous, unstrategic." "Maybe," I said. "She just didn't want to die alone in a maintenance corridor." The diplomat was still for a long moment. Then the bioluminescent patterns did something I'd never seen before. The translator produced a sound that was something between a click and a chord, and then the word it generated was unexpected. "Human," the patterns said in their way. "We have been negotiating with the Vilthari for 60 years about 3 planetary systems. In all that time, no one has said anything that simple." I waited. "The systems are not the point," the diplomat said. "The history we made in them is the point. If our history is acknowledged," the patterns ran complex, "we could discuss the systems differently." I looked at them. "Have you said that directly to Seraphine or her team?" A long pause. "No," the diplomat said. "Among the Vrethkai, to state what you truly want is," another translator struggle. "It is a vulnerability. It requires trust." "Then we have something in common," I said. "Because where I'm from, that's exactly what it requires." I won't claim I resolved the 60-year dispute. I didn't. That's not how diplomacy works, and it's not my place to claim credit for something that required years of careful work by people far more qualified than me. What I can say is that the meeting I had with the Vrethkai diplomat was cited, later in the formal record of the negotiations, as a turning point. The language shifted after that. Something that had been stuck moved. What I had contributed was the thing I'd always been able to do, even back in Knoxville, even in the service, even on every post I'd ever held. I listened to what someone actually meant, not what they said, and I said it back to them. That's not a galactic superpower. That's just paying attention. On the 14th day of negotiations, something else happened that I should tell you about. There was an incident, a second one. Not like the corridor, there was no immediate crisis, no dying, no seconds counting down, but significant in its own way. One of the Vrethkai delegation's subordinate members, a junior diplomat who'd been present at every session but had never spoken, approached me in a corridor outside the conference level. Alone, without their translator active. The bioluminescent patterns were running in something I didn't have a reference for, nothing in the briefing materials, nothing from the sessions. Something that felt, for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, like warning. They produced a data chip, small, standard format, the kind that works with any common terminal. They held it out. I looked at it, I didn't take it. What's on that? I asked. No translator, no spoken response, just the patterns. I activated my own translator's visual interpretation mode, which works roughly if the being you're dealing with is using clear, high-contrast patterns and not moving too fast. The reading it gave me was fragmentary and uncertain, but there were words I could make out. Information, danger, heir secondary, the ones who killed Kethris. I went still. The investigation had officially closed 4 months ago with 3 Velthari faction members identified and sanctioned. Case closed. I'd accepted that. Okonkwo had accepted it. The Velthari security apparatus had accepted it. But the junior diplomat was holding a data chip, and their patterns were saying something about Kethris, and something about the heir secondary, and something that my translator's visual mode was rendering as not finished. I took the chip. What was on it? And I want to be careful here, because some of this remains under active diplomatic review, and I'm telling you what I can. What was on it was a communication log. Vrethkai format, which required 2 days and a specialist to decrypt. The communication log documented a series of exchanges between the identified Velthari faction members and someone who was not Velthari. Someone who had been present on Koreth Station for the past 8 months. Someone who was currently involved in a different set of diplomatic proceedings on a different level of the station. The attack on Seraphine hadn't been a Velthari internal political act. That had been the cover story, and it had been a good one, convincing enough that the investigation had found exactly what it was meant to find and stopped where it was meant to stop. The real motivation and the real sponsor had come from outside the Velthari hierarchy entirely. I won't say who, not here. That part of the story belongs to the people whose job it is to tell it. What I will say is this. I took what was on that chip to Okonkwo and to the Velthari security chief, and then I took it to Seraphine. And I watched her face when she understood what it meant. Among the Velthari, extreme emotion produces a specific response in the crystal walls around them. Not the color shifts I'd learned to read, something more fundamental. A resonance, a vibration you can feel in the floor, in the air, in your own chest if you're paying attention. The room resonated. She held it together long enough to say what she needed to say to the security team. She gave clear, precise instructions. She answered every question completely. She was, throughout all of it, exactly the diplomat and the leader that she'd been trained her entire life to be. And when the last person left the room and it was just the 2 of us, the walls went a color I'd never seen. Deep red, not aggressive, something more like grief, like blood that's been there long enough to grow dark. They're still coming after you, I said. Apparently, she said. I need you to let me do my job, I said. Fully. No filtered information, no strategic buffer between me and what's actually happening. She looked at me. You already have more information than any protective officer in Velthari history has ever had. I know, I said. I'm asking for more. A long pause. Why? She asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Because someone tried to kill you 7 months ago, and they haven't stopped, I said, and I have no intention of standing 3 feet away while they try again. The walls shifted, the red gentled, something warmer underneath it. You gave me your veil, she said quietly. You've reorganized your entire professional life. You've read 400 pages of negotiating history, and sat with alien diplomats, and held information that most people in your position would have found a reason to pass up the chain. Yes, I said. Why? She asked again, and this time it wasn't about the intelligence. It was the other question, the one that had been in the room for 7 months. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the dark red walls that had gone warm, and I thought about the maintenance corridor, and the silver coming back to her eyes, and 14 hours of debriefing, and 400 pages of briefing materials, and a Vrethkai diplomat's bioluminescent pattern saying trust, and the small nod she'd given me before I answered yes, I'm the bonded. Because she's worth protecting, I said. And because she doesn't think so. The walls did the gold-silver thing, certain and warm and staying. That is not accurate, she said. Which part? I know my worth, she said. What I don't know, she stopped, started again. What I'm still learning is whether I'm allowed to let someone else know it too. The remainder of the Vrethkai negotiations concluded 2 weeks later. The framework that emerged, which went through 17 more rounds of formal drafting and won't be finalized for another year, probably, was the first real movement in the 60-year dispute. The Vrethkai got what they'd actually wanted: formal acknowledgement, in diplomatic language that will be recorded and recognized, that the history they made in the three systems has permanent standing, regardless of how the territorial question resolves. The Velthari got movement on the territorial question itself, which had been locked for decades. Nobody got everything. Everyone got something real. The lead Vrethkai diplomat, on the last day of their formal presence on the station, found me in the corridor outside the conference level and did something I hadn't expected. They reached out one long, multi-jointed arm and placed the tip of one finger on my right hand. Just that. Contact, brief and precise. The translator said, "Gratitude for plainness." I said, "Thank you for trusting me with what you actually wanted." The bioluminescent patterns did something I recognized by then. The thing I'd started thinking of as their version of a slow nod. The night after the Vrethkai delegation departed, Korath Station was in the middle of its dark cycle, and the embassy was quiet in that particular way that diplomatic spaces get quiet when the formal work is done, and everyone has finally exhaled. I was on my standard evening post, in the study anteroom, which was where I positioned myself during Seraphine's working evenings, close enough to be effective and distant enough to give her the space that she needed and that I'd learned to give without her having to ask. I was reading. I read a lot more than I used to. It's hard to spend time in proximity to someone who treats information like oxygen, without developing a relationship with it yourself. She came to the doorway of the study. She didn't come through it, she stood in it, which is a specific spatial choice in Velthari culture, halfway in and halfway not. "Cole," she said. "Serenity. I have something to say." "All right," I said, and put down what I was reading. "You've been told that you can't leave," she said. "That the bond makes it medically inadvisable to separate us by significant distance for extended periods. That my people's law has created obligations that keep you here." "I've been told that," I said carefully. "I want you to know," she said, "that none of those things are why I want you here." I waited. "The bond is real," she said. "The medical implications are real, the law is real, but those things exist for beings who wouldn't stay otherwise. They're structures built for reluctance." She held my eyes. "I don't want your reluctant presence. I don't want you here because the alternative creates medical complications. I want you here because," she paused. For her, that pause was significant. She never paused. "I want you here because the embassy is a more honest place with you in it." "An honest place," I repeated. "You said what the Vrethkai actually wanted when no one else had in 60 years, she said. "You told me that you would give your blood again if you had to. You sat in front of an ancient panel of my people and said yes to everything without knowing the cost." She paused again. "You make things true. I don't know how to explain it better than that." I stood up. I didn't think about whether it was protocol or not. "For what it's worth," I said, "when I made that first choice in the corridor, I wasn't thinking about anything except the fact that I wasn't going to let you die if I could stop it." "I know," she said. "That's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean." The walls of the whole embassy, every floor, every room, every living crystal surface shifted color at once. Not the private colors of one person's space. Something that moved through the entire building like a breath. That gold-silver, warm and certain. I'd never seen it happen to the whole building at once. I didn't know it could. 8 months after the corridor. My posting has been formally reclassified to a new category that the DPC created specifically for my situation, because no existing classification covered it. They called it Bonded Protective Assignment and wrote protocols around it that I helped draft, because I was the only person on the Terran side with direct experience of what the situation actually required. Major Okonkwo visited the station last month. She walked into the study, looked at me, looked at the walls doing their quiet silver working color, looked at the map Seraphine had been updating with those thin silver lines, and then looked at me again. "You look different," she said. "I'm told I'm changing," I said. "Is that," she stopped, started again, "are you all right with that?" I thought about it, really thought about it, not the official answer. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." She nodded slowly. "The DPC brass have been asking me whether you want reassignment, whether the new classification is something you want to continue." "Yes," I said, "I want to continue." "Because you have to?" she asked. "The bond?" "No," I said, "because I want to." She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded again, differently. The nod that means I understand something now that I didn't before, and it surprises me a little. "All right, Cole," she said, "carry on." There's a version of this story where the ending is obvious, where I tell you that the human soldier fell for the vampire princess, and she fell for him, and they lived happily in their crystal embassy, and that's the whole arc, wrapped up clean. That's not quite the story. The real story is messier, more gradual, more interesting than that. It's a story that's still happening. The 3 contested systems are still being negotiated. The investigation into whoever commissioned the attack on Seraphine is ongoing. I'm still adapting to whatever I'm becoming biologically. The medical team does monthly checks, and every month there's something new, some small shift in my cellular profile that they note carefully in their reports and discuss in language that I mostly understand but sometimes have to ask her to translate. She always translates carefully. Completely. That's the thing about Seraphine Veilthar Orin. She gives you everything when she decides you're worth giving it to, every context, every piece of information, every honest answer to every honest question. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just suddenly, gradually, irreversibly, the way things are. There's an evening every few weeks when the formal work of the day winds down and the station is quiet, and the walls are doing their private color, that deep, comfortable indigo, and she'll say something that's either the last note from her reading or the first note from something she's been thinking about for days. And I'll answer, and we'll be in it together. That conversation that doesn't have a proper start or end, that just continues from where it left off last time. Those evenings are the ones I don't tell the DPC about in my reports. They're not relevant to the mission. They're not relevant to anything except the fact of what happens when 2 completely different kinds of people decide, each in their own way, that the other one is worth knowing. The last thing I want to tell you happened about 2 weeks ago. She was reading something. Old, very old, I don't know what. I've given up trying to identify everything she reads because the catalog is essentially the entire recorded history of the galaxy. And I was at my post in the anteroom, and I must have been thinking about something because she called my name, and when I looked up she was watching me the way she does. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Home," I said. "Knoxville I was thinking about." I paused. "It seems very far away." "Do you miss it?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. I miss certain things, the mountains, my dad. A particular diner that has pie that doesn't exist anywhere else in the universe. I'm fairly confident. "You could go," she said. "The bond." "I know what the bond says," I said. "I'm not talking about the bond." She waited. "I'm talking about the fact that there's a 60-year negotiation that finally moved, and a security situation that isn't fully resolved, And 400 pages of briefing materials I'm still annotating in the margins, I said. And someone who explains things completely and trusts me with real information, and I stopped. I'm exactly where I want to be. The walls went gold-silver, the whole building again like a breath. And from the study, very quietly, in a voice that was as careful as everything she said but carrying something underneath that had learned over 8 months to let itself be heard, "So am I." A vampire princess refused to let a human soldier leave. That's how people are telling this story. That's the version that's been circulating in the DPC barracks and the diplomatic gossip channels. And I'm told, at least 2 separate xenobiological research papers that used our bond as a case study. Here's what actually happened. A human soldier decided not to leave. And an ancient, careful, extraordinary being decided, perhaps for the first time in longer than I can imagine, to let someone all the way in. The rest is details. The rest is the conversation that keeps going, in a crystal embassy floating in the middle of Korath Station, where the walls know how to say what we're still learning to say out loud. And the rest, and this is the part that still catches me sometimes, quietly, in the middle of the night, when the station is dark, and the walls are that comfortable indigo and I'm more myself than I've been anywhere else in 31 years of living. The rest is just beginning.